Today we're going to talk about werewolves. What the heck am I talking about? Well, to start out with, as you know, this website I'm trying to make for the hair site is as comprehensive as I can on everything to do with hair restoration, to our technique, the results of our technique, and I expanded recently the section on hair loss because I think a lot of people suffer from different conditions that are usually quite rare, but I thought those would be helpful in your search of looking for a hair transplant surgeon. We probably once or twice a year find someone that has alopecia areata or something else that may bar them from having surgery, and I thought that I just wanted to give you as much of a comprehensive site as possible. And in my research and building this site, there was an area that I put on my site called hypertrichosis, which essentially means an abnormal amount of hair in areas where you usually don't grow terminal hairs, which are thick dark hairs versus where we usually have thin vellus hairs. So I thought I was going to relate to you a story of werewolves, but real life werewolves, real people. I think that, I don't mean that in a condescending way, because it's certainly, I don't mean this as a very sensitive subject, but I thought that part of how we figured out the legends of werewolves started from real life examples, potentially. The first story that I want to tell you is a story back in France with Henry II. And during this time in the late Middle Ages, Henry II had a lot of unusual animals and unusual people come to his court. He was given different camels and leopards and different animals from Africa, and one of his gifts was actually a slave child called Pedro Gonzalez, who came from the island of the Canary Islands, in an island called Tenerife. And when he came there, he was given to him because he had this sable-like hair growing all over his face. And what was interesting with this, initially he was considered an unusual sideshow type of thing, but he actually showed a considerable facility with the Latin and French languages. And he started to actually get better and better at this, and he became a very, very important servant and helper for Henry II. Interestingly, after Henry II passed on, Pedro Gonzalez, or Don Pedro, was given over to other royal families, and his livelihood was painting. And what's interesting is he actually married, reportedly, a very attractive French woman, and when they got married, they actually had children. They had 3 sons and 2 daughters. And all 5 children actually were affected from this unusual genetic disorder where it grows hair all over the face and all over the body, and looking like almost like a werewolf. And what happened is that the 2 daughters actually were very, very reclusive. It's actually even a harder disease in female children. But the 3 sons were a little bit more gregarious out there and were able to live a semi-normal life. And what happened was one of the sons, Enrico, was sold as a servant or a slave to another very prominent man, and this man was in Innsbruck, Austria, and the castle was called the Ambrose Castle. And interestingly enough, the syndrome, Ambrose syndrome, which we'll talk about more in a moment, named after this, is named after one of these, the son of Don Pedro, Enrico, who lived in this castle. But he convinced his master to let him go back to the wilds of nature, because he said that we have all these animal powers that you know, we have possession on. We cannot resist that. So actually, his master set him up in this gorgeous place in this idyllic village where he married several women over time, not at the same time, but he married several women and had children from that union that had some hairy features as well. And then the father, Don Pedro, actually lived the rest of his life with his son Enrico in this nice village until he passed on at the age of 80, which is very old for way back then. So it's interesting just to give you a little story about how all this started, but the chance of having this werewolf syndrome or this curse of the hair, or more specifically, they call it congenital hypertrichosis lagunosa, which is the lanugo hairs that a baby has that turns into a terminal hair or thicker hair all over the body. There are 2 kinds. One is the one we just mentioned, which is Ambrose syndrome, and it's much longer hair that grows out, and it's much straighter, from like 4 to 10 inches long, and that's all over the body and face, and it tends to be much more serious in men than women. Although, as I said, women sometimes obviously have a harder time dealing with it from a social perspective than men. And then the other type doesn't really have quite a name, but it's one that comes from a Mexican family, and that that has been noted to have a much shorter hair that's curlier, but also does cover the whole body, and also has a little bit more of a patchy distribution when it comes to women as well. As you know, other things can cause hypertrichosis as well, such as drugs, oral minoxidil, or we'll use Rogaine for the scalp. That can also cause some, but in general, the oral pill can cause more of this. There's other types of medications that can cause this as well. And just as one small final point, if we want to just briefly talk about science, is that hypertrichosis and hirsutism are very different conditions. Hirsutism it occurs in females that develop hair patterns that are very similar to a sexually mature male, like across here, or across the chest, or across the arms, or in the beard distribution. So I just thought that would be interesting to cover a little bit about what hypertrichosis is all about, as well as discuss an interesting story, and also subdivide some of the cases of hypertrichosis that are out there.